When Lily pointed to the man in court, it answered every question about whether she remembered. But when Marble, a retired canine, lunged at that same man, it raised a chilling new question. What did he remember that no one else could see before we begin this unforgettable story? Would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you. Please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Willow Bend, Oregon, was cloaked in a heavy dawn mist that curled low over the riverbanks and seeped into the narrow streets like a memory refusing to fade. The morning was unusually cold for early October, with the sky hung in a pewter gray that matched the silence pressing against every window pane. A drizzle had started just before midnight and hadn't quite stopped, turning the old wooden porches of the town into slick, glistening platforms from the outside. The Carter house seemed peaceful and aging. Two-story farmhouse at the edge of Willow Street, with faded blue paint and a wind chime that clinked faintly in the breeze. But inside, everything was wrong. Heather Carter was late getting home from her overnight shift at the community medical clinic. A woman in her late 30s with deep auburn hair tied in a no-nonsense braid. Heather had the lean frame of someone constantly in motion and eyes the color of oversteeped tea, warm but tired. She was known for her compassion, particularly toward the elderly patients in town. But recent months had dulled her gentle edge. The sudden loss of her husband to a heart attack the previous winter had left a quiet dent in her smile, and though she masked it well, the grief had settled deep in her bones. She parked her car in the gravel driveway, her nurse's badge still clipped to her jacket, and hurried up the steps under the low-hanging porch light. As she reached the door, a chill slid through her spine. The front door was slightly ajar. Her first instinct was denial. Maybe she hadn't latched it properly before leaving. But Heather wasn't careless. She was meticulous, especially since it was just her and Lily now. Pushing the door open, she called out, her voice low but firm, "Lily, sweetheart." "It's Mom." No answer. The house was quiet, too quiet. The kitchen light was still on, casting a sterile glow over the table where Lily had last eaten dinner. Chicken nuggets, untouched apple slices, a glass of milk half finished. Heather's heart began to pound as she moved down the hallway, calling her daughter's name again. The living room was empty. The bathroom door creaked open under her fingers. Nothing. Then she reached Lily's bedroom. The small nightlight shaped like a fox glowed dimly near the baseboard. But the bed was empty, the sheets still neatly made. Heather scanned the room, then opened the closet. And there she was. Lily Carter was curled up in the back corner, her knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around them. At 8 years old. Lily had inherited her mother's chestnut hair and hazel eyes, but the brightness that usually danced in them was gone. She trembled, but didn't cry. Her pajamas, light blue with yellow stars, were slightly damp, as if she had been sweating or crying silently before falling into that stillness. Heather dropped to her knees, whispering, "Lily, baby, it's me. Are you okay?" She reached out gently, touching her daughter's arm. No reaction, no words, not even a blink. Heather held her close, whispering into her hair, rocking her softly. But Lily didn't respond. She didn't speak. She didn't resist. It was as if someone had pressed mute on her spirit. The police arrived within 15 minutes, their cruisers casting blue-red light across the wet yard. Officer Daniels, a broad man with a kind but skeptical face, took the lead. He and his partner moved through the house, searching for any signs of forced entry. There were none. The windows were locked. Nothing was broken, nothing was missing, no footprints on the damp floors. It was as if no one had ever been there. Except something that had terrified a bright, joyful little girl into complete silence. Daniels took Heather's statement, but his tone hinted at doubt. Sometimes kids imagine things, especially after a parent's death, he said, trying to be gentle. Stress can do strange things. Heather wanted to scream, but she didn't. She just nodded, clutching Lily tighter. The file was opened and closed, just like that. 2 days later, in an office above the town's aging post office building, Detective Jake Holloway opened the report and felt something in his gut twist. Jake was in his mid-40s, with storm-gray eyes and a shaved head that made him look colder than he was. He'd spent a decade in Portland PD before relocating to Willow Bend to get away from the noise of his own past. A past haunted by missed opportunities and one case in particular that had never let him sleep. The disappearance of Tessa Hartman. A 7-year-old girl who vanished from her backyard 2 years ago. The case had gone cold. Jake blamed himself. He had chased the wrong lead, missed a crucial piece of evidence, and the girl had simply vanished. As he read Heather's statement and saw Lily's symptoms, selective mutism, night terrors, refusal to eat or speak, he felt the same echo, the same pattern, and the same gnawing guilt. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight, and stared out the rain-speckled window. "It's happening again," he whispered. Then he stood, grabbed his coat, and headed for the Carter house. If he had any chance of making things right this time, it had to start now. The fog hadn't lifted much in Willow Bend, as if the sky itself grieved silently for all the things left unspoken. That morning, the air carried a dull chill, the kind that slid beneath collars and tugged at thoughts better left buried. Heather Carter stood beside her car, adjusting the scarf around her neck as she glanced back at the house. Lily sat quietly in the back seat, her small form barely moving, wrapped in a pale pink hoodie with the hood drawn over her head. Her face was turned toward the window, expression unreadable, as if the town outside no longer existed to her. Heather opened the door and climbed in. "Starting the engine. We'll just go see." "Okay," she said softly. Lily didn't respond. She never did these days. The road out of town was lined with tall, skeletal trees, their leaves long since surrendered to the season. The Rehabilitation and Therapy Animal Center of East Valley was 30 miles away, located on a former farm turned sanctuary on the far side of the hills. Heather had spent the past few nights researching it, every article, every study, every faint hope. Her exhaustion was palpable, the kind of weariness that didn't just cling to skin, it soaked into marrow, yet beneath it, something small and determined remained. The gravel crunched under the tires as they pulled into the center's drive. The building was a large, weathered barn that had been retrofitted with wide glass windows and cedar shingles. A white wooden fence encircled the training yard, where several dogs trotted between obstacle courses or lounged in the pale sun. Heather spotted a woman already waiting near the front porch. Dr. Ellen Rowe was in her late 40s, with ash-blonde hair tied back in a low ponytail and a strong, stocky build that suggested both steadiness and stamina. Her clothes were simple, gray jeans, thick cable-knit sweater under a utility vest, and her eyes, a piercing green, missed nothing. She had the look of someone who'd lived many lives in a short span. Heather later learned she had served as a canine behaviorist in several trauma relief missions overseas. Only settling down after a shrapnel injury ended her field career, Mrs. Carter, Dr. Rowe said, offering a firm handshake. Her voice was low and even, the kind that neither rushed nor demanded. Heather nodded. "And this must be Lily," she added, glancing toward the child still sitting in the car. She didn't speak to her directly, didn't kneel or smile exaggeratedly like others had tried. She simply gave a nod and stepped back. "Let's head inside." The center smelled faintly of cedarwood and antiseptic. Framed photographs lined the hallway, children clutching their therapy dogs, quiet smiles on their faces. Heather held Lily's hand, though the little girl did not hold back. It was like holding on to mist. Dr. Rowe guided them into a large open room lined with mats and soft beds. Some of the dogs rested peacefully. Others walked beside handlers through calm, deliberate routines. "We work primarily with children affected by trauma, grief, abuse, displacement," Dr. Rowe explained. "Many of our dogs are rescues themselves. Others are retired service animals. Today, I'd like Lily to meet someone special." She gestured toward a doorway where another staff member had just entered. A tall, lanky man with a mop of ginger hair and a slightly nervous demeanor. "This is Thomas," she said simply. "He's Marble's handler." Thomas gave a small nod. "Hi." He seemed barely out of his 20s, the kind of young man who always looked like he was trying not to trip over his own feet. But his hands were calm, and his voice had a natural gentleness. "I'll bring him in," moments later. The door opened again. Marble entered the room slowly, padding across the wooden floor with a quiet confidence. He was large for a golden retriever, just over 80 pounds, with a rich, honey-colored coat that shimmered even in the soft light. His eyes were dark brown and wide, filled with something rare. Intelligence without demand, warmth without insistence, on his left shoulder. A faint scar curved like a crescent beneath the fur, a reminder of a past lived in risk. Heather noticed how Lily's head lifted slightly. It wasn't much, but it was more than before. "This is Marble," Dr. Rowe said quietly. "He used to serve in a K-9 unit, mostly search and recovery. His last assignment ended after his partner, Officer Jason Lorne, was killed during an ambush. Marble was wounded in that operation." Heather's fingers tightened around the strap of her purse. She remembered the name. Lorne. He'd made local news 2 years ago, part of a cross-county task force investigating missing children cases. Heather looked down at Lily, then back at the dog. "May I ask why he was retired?" He stopped responding to standard commands. Rowe said, didn't trust new handlers, refused high-stress scenarios, but he remained calm around children. One of our team noticed how he reacted when a child approached. He'd soften, almost lean into them. Marble stood in the center of the room, gaze flicking toward Lily but not approaching. He didn't bark, didn't wag, just watched. "He's trained to wait for invitation." Thomas said, "No sudden moves if Lily wants to meet him. She just needs to reach out." They waited. The silence stretched, unbending, until Lily did something no one expected. She shifted, just slightly. Her foot moved forward, then her arm extended, the hand small, pale, fingers trembling. Marble took one step, then another. He moved gently, slowly, stopping within reach. Lily touched his head with feather-light fingers, her breath catching audibly in her throat. Heather turned away, tears stinging her eyes. Meanwhile, at a quiet office in the Willow Bend Sheriff's Station, Jake Holloway tapped the address of the Animal Therapy Center into his GPS. He stared at the printout of Marble's history on his desk, noting the date of Lorne's death and the chilling fact that his final investigation had centered around a lead that eventually connected to the Hartman case. Jake rubbed his jaw. "Why didn't we follow up on that unit's intel?" He stood. Grabbing his coat, maybe Marble didn't just offer therapy. Maybe he still remembered. The wind shifted just after midnight in Willow Bend. The trees groaned beneath its weight, and the mist that had hugged the town for days began to pull apart like old gauze. It was a strange kind of quiet, the kind that carried weight, as if something stood just outside the edge of sound, watching. Heather Carter stirred from her half-sleep, instinct pulling her upright in bed before her mind caught up. A hum of unease had lodged deep in her chest, the kind of mother's intuition that didn't need logic to make sense. She checked the clock, 12:41 a.m., and swung her legs over the edge of the bed, slipping on the hoodie draped across her chair. The house creaked faintly, but not unusually so. Still, something felt off. She padded barefoot down the hallway, avoiding the floorboard that always creaked just outside Lily's room. The door was slightly ajar. Marble was already awake. The golden retriever stood rigid by the window, his entire posture taut, fur bristling along his back. A low, guttural growl rumbled from his throat, not loud, but primal. Lily stood beside him, her face partially obscured by the curtain. Unmoving, her small hand resting lightly on his collar, Lily Heather whispered, stepping inside. The little girl didn't react, but her eyes remained fixed beyond the glass. Heather followed their gaze and froze. There, near the tree line at the edge of the backyard, was a silhouette not moving, just watching. It stood just beyond the reach of the motion light, barely distinguishable from the dark trunks of the pine trees. Yet Heather knew instantly it was a person, tall, broad-shouldered, arms at his sides, for a beat too long. The figure did not budge then. As if aware of being noticed, it turned slowly and melted into the woods, swallowed by shadow. Marble barked sharply, a sound that made Heather's blood run cold. She pulled Lily away from the window with shaking hands. "It's okay, baby, it's okay," she said, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. Lily offered no resistance, no words. Just watch the darkness where the figure had disappeared. Heather locked the doors, double-checked every window, then sat at the kitchen table, long after Lily had returned to bed. Her hands trembled as she dialed the sheriff's office. She gave her statement as calmly as she could. But the woman on the other end of the line, Deputy Lane. A young officer with a clipped tone, sounded more procedural than alarmed. "We'll send a unit to sweep the property, but if they didn't break in and there's no evidence left behind, there's not much we can do tonight," Lane said, not unkindly, but not urgently either. Heather hung up and stared at the refrigerator, the magnets, the drawings, the empty space. Her breath felt thin in her chest. The next morning, Lily was already awake when Heather walked into the kitchen. She sat at the table, her hair messy and unbrushed, a box of crayons open in front of her. A blank sheet of paper lay between her small hands. Heather said nothing. She poured coffee in silence, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the window, toward the woods. The wind had stopped. Lily picked up a black crayon and began to draw. She moved slowly but deliberately. First, a house with a window, then a child and a dog, small figures peering through the glass. Next came a shadow at the edge of the yard, finally, a hand, just a hand, emerging from the silhouette. And on that hand, unmistakably drawn in deep red, was a jagged scar. Heather inhaled sharply. Her cup paused midair. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the paper. "Lily, did you see this?" Lily didn't speak. She never did, but she didn't look away either. Heather picked up her phone and called Jake Holloway. Jake had been reviewing old notes when the call came. He was sitting at his desk, the photo of Tessa Hartman staring back at him from a faded missing persons flyer pinned to the corkboard above. The girl had vanished from her own backyard 2 years earlier. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, no prints. The only thing she'd left behind was a single drawing, almost forgotten now in the file's back pocket, a crude sketch of a man with a scar on his wrist. He had almost convinced himself it was coincidence. Until now. Jake arrived at the Carter house just after noon. His truck, an old navy blue Ford with dents along the fender, pulled up beside the mailbox. He stepped out slowly, taking in the property with the kind of cautious gaze that came from years of watching crime scenes turn into memories. Heather met him at the porch, eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. She drew something, she said, handing him the paper before he even reached the door. Jake took it carefully, his eyes scanning the crayon lines. That scar. He murmured, "I thought it was nothing at first." Heather whispered, "But now—" Jake stepped inside and found Lily seated on the couch, Marble lying beside her like a sentinel. The dog's eyes followed Jake without moving his head. Jake didn't approach. He knelt instead, lowering himself to Lily's eye level. "I remember a little girl who drew something like this 2 years ago," he said gently. "Her name was Tessa. She saw the same scar." Lily didn't respond, but her hand moved slightly toward Marble, resting lightly on his neck. Jake straightened, turning back to Heather. The man from the Tessa case drove a truck. "We had a witness say it was a silver pickup, maybe older model. It never showed up again." Heather's eyes widened. Lily said nothing, but this morning she drew something else. She pulled a second page from the counter. This one half-finished. A driveway, a vehicle, a silver-gray truck. Boxy and uneven, parked just past the tree line. Jake's voice dropped. "That's the same truck from the original report. Same make, same body shape." He stared at the image as if it might blink. Morning came slow and gray in Willowbend. The fog lingered low in the yard like a secret, and the dew on the grass shimmered faintly beneath the pale sun. Inside the Carter home, the scent of toast and weak coffee hung in the air. But the kitchen was silent. Heather sat at the table, watching her daughter draw. Lily's brow was furrowed, her hand steady as she moved the black crayon across the page, tracing lines with a quiet intensity far beyond her age. She had started the new drawing that morning without prompting. There was no asking, no discussion, just the pull of something deep inside her, something unspoken that demanded to be released. Marble lay at her feet, his large golden body still and patient, his head resting near her socks. Every so often, Lily would pause and place a hand on his shoulder, not for guidance but for grounding, as if Marble's presence helped her remember something that scared her into silence. The image that emerged was chilling. A truck, unmistakably silver and old, parked beside a grove of thin pine trees. A man sat inside, barely outlined in shadow, but visible enough a dark baseball cap, a strong jawline, and a thick forearm resting on the wheel. His hand bore a long, jagged scar, the same shape Lily had drawn the day before. But this time, there was something new. On the truck's rear window, scrawled as if by a child's finger across foggy glass, were 2 words, "Don't tell." Heather's breath hitched. She reached for the paper slowly, as if it might catch fire. "Lily," she said gently, This is what he said to you." "Isn't it?" Lily didn't answer, but she placed her small hand on Marble again. And this time, her fingers curled slightly into his fur. Marble shifted just enough to nuzzle her knee, then stilled again. Heather didn't press further. Instead, she sent the photo of the drawing to Jake. Jake Holloway had been at the sheriff's department for most of the night, poring over traffic footage from nearby highway cameras. He looked ragged. His normally crisp shirt sleeves were wrinkled, and his dark eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. His desk was cluttered with photos, vehicle records, and old case notes, the past bleeding into the present. When the photo came through, his stomach tightened. He recognized the phrasing immediately. "Don't tell" wasn't just a threat. It had been part of a previous case, one that had haunted the Portland unit 3 years ago. A child survivor, barely 5, had said those words repeatedly during her interviews. The context had never been clear. But a K-9 handler at Officer Lorne, Marble's old partner, had flagged the phrase after seeing it scratched into a barn wall near a known suspect's cabin. No charges had been filed, but the lead had never fully closed. Jake stood and headed for the department's lower archives, where old records gathered dust and memory. It took 20 minutes, but he found it, an incident report filed under Bert Kingsley, a local repairman who had once been investigated in relation to a child endangerment complaint, but was cleared due to lack of physical evidence. Jake read slowly. Kingsley had driven a 2003 Dodge Ram, silver gray. License plate partially obscured in the original report. The man was in his late 40s now, tall with thinning brown hair and a reputation for working odd jobs in remote parts of the county. According to notes in the file, he had once trained as an apprentice mechanic before drifting between towns, always leaving quietly when questions were asked. Jake closed the folder and walked straight into Captain Dorsey's office. Captain Marion Dorsey was a short, broad-shouldered woman in her early 50s, with tightly curled silver hair and a voice that could hush an entire room mid-sentence. She had been sheriff of Willow Bend for nearly a decade, known for her no-nonsense attitude and an old injury that left her favoring her left knee. She looked up from her paperwork as Jake entered. "You look like hell," she said bluntly. Jake handed her the folder. "So does this." She read in silence, flipping through the photos and case summaries. Her eyes narrowed at the photo of the truck. "This from the Carter kid." Jake nodded. "She's drawn the truck multiple times." She added a figure and a cap. And today, she wrote, "Don't tell." Marble reacted strongly. He recognized the phrase. Lorne flagged it in a related case before he was killed. Dorsey tapped the desk. "You think it's Kingsley. I think he's not just a name on a sheet. I think Lily saw him. And I think he knows she did. And you're certain it's not suggestion from the adults around her." Jake shook his head. "She doesn't speak. She draws what she remembers. We're not feeding her anything." Dorsey leaned back. "All right. Then we need to find the damn truck." That evening, back at the Carter house, Lily finished another drawing, this one showing the inside of the truck. A dashboard, a hand on the gear shift, a figure in the rearview mirror. Heather froze when she saw it, because the reflection in the mirror wasn't the man in the cap. It was her daughter. Heather reached out with trembling hands, brushing the paper with her fingertips. She stared at Lily, her eyes wide with fear and awe. "You were in that truck," she whispered. Lily's hand went to Marble's back again, and for the first time, she pressed her face into his fur and stayed there. The courthouse in Riverview stood tall in old red brick, built at a time when architecture still tried to impress with a weight and symmetry. Its narrow windows glinted under a rare, clear sky. A cold spring morning stretched thin with anticipation. Heather Carter stood just outside its broad double doors, clutching Lily's hand gently but firmly. She was dressed in muted gray, her auburn hair pulled into a low twist, every inch of her posture taut with protective strength. Lily stood beside her, pale but calm. Her small fingers tangled in Marble's fur. She wore a simple navy blue dress and white tights, her hair neatly brushed into a single braid. Marble, wearing a blue service vest, stood like a golden statue, perfectly still, yet hyper-aware. His gaze scanned the square, his tail twitching ever so slightly when someone came too close. Inside the courtroom, the air buzzed with quiet tension. The gallery was filled with reporters, local townsfolk, and a few distant observers from larger legal advocacy groups. Among them sat Diane and Marshall Hartman, parents of Tessa, the girl who had vanished 2 years ago. Diane was thin and bird-like, with weathered cheeks and a look of permanent grieving, while Marshall's broad shoulders and deep-set eyes gave away a man who had aged quickly under the weight of loss. Jake Holloway spotted them as soon as he entered the courtroom. He hesitated at the door, his breath catching in his chest. This was the moment he had avoided for far too long. With slow, deliberate steps, he crossed the aisle and stood before them. Diane looked up first. "I should have seen it back then," Jake said, voice low. "I followed the wrong trail, and I'm sorry." Marshall nodded once, not a word, not a sentence, just a quiet nod, the kind that didn't forget, but forgave. The judge entered, all rise. Judge Raymond Hill was a tall, silver-haired man in his late 60s, with a voice that rolled deep like thunder. Respected across 3 counties, Hill had presided over everything from civil fraud to child endangerment, and carried the weight of justice like a robe tailored to his bones. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The defendant was brought in last. Bert Kingsley looked older than his 48 years. His hair had thinned considerably since his arrest, his frame thick and hunched as if the weight of exposure had finally pressed down upon him. He wore a muted beige jumpsuit, his wrists shackled, though his expression remained unmoved. No panic, no guilt, just quiet calculation. Lily's eyes fixed on him. She didn't speak, but after a long moment, her hand lifted and rested on Marble's back, right at his shoulder. Marble froze. Then, with sudden intensity, the golden retriever bared his teeth and let out a piercing, rattling growl, followed by a sharp bark that cracked through the courtroom like a whip. The room gasped. Heather placed a protective arm in front of Lily, but Marble didn't advance. He simply stood his ground, gaze locked on Kingsley. The man shifted in his seat, just barely, but enough. Ordered Judge Hill's gavel came down hard. "Control your animal, Miss Carter." Jake stood. "Your Honor, if I may. Marble is a trained K-9 retired from federal child recovery operations. His behavior is significant." Judge Hill leaned forward. "Noted. Continue." The prosecution called Detective Holloway to the stand. Jake moved with the practiced ease of someone who'd lived in courtrooms but rarely had to speak for his failures. His testimony was calm, detailed. He walked through the investigation, the drawings, the surveillance footage, the prior reports of Kingsley's suspicious behavior, and finally, Lily's silent revelations. Then came the drawings. They were laid out one by one, scans projected for the room to see. The truck, the man with the scar, the words, "Don't tell," and finally, Lily in the rearview mirror of that truck. The courtroom held its breath. The defense attorney, a wiry man named Gavin Clements with a voice like dry paper, argued that the child's drawings were subjective, that Marble's reaction was inconclusive, that no physical evidence tied Kingsley directly to Lily or the missing girl Tessa. But the jury had eyes, and they had ears, and they had hearts. The turning point came when Lily was quietly asked, not to testify in words but to draw, a court-appointed therapist. Mira Danvers, a soft-spoken woman in her 40s with curly brown hair and warm brown skin. Entered and offered Lily a fresh sheet of paper and a few crayons. No one said a word. Lily took the black crayon. She drew herself and Marble, standing between her and a shadow. The shadow now had a clearer face, the eyes under the cap, the line of the scar, and in the figure's hand. A chain, not touching her, but close, implied threat. Lily set the crayon down. Then she turned to Marble, leaned in close, and whispered, "Good boy." The courtroom didn't erupt, but it did break. A collective exhale. Some wept quietly. Heather's shoulders shook. Jake's eyes closed, his jaw clenched. The judge called for a recess. Hours later, the jury returned, guilty. Bert Kingsley was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The courtroom emptied slowly. Jake lingered, watching as Diane and Marshall Hartman left hand in hand, quieter than before. The pain would never vanish. But now, it was no longer empty. Weeks passed. Lily began to speak more, not in long sentences, not in explanations, but in fragments that mattered. Cold truck, man in hat, not safe, but also Marble stay and draw with me. Heather said yes to all of it. Jake submitted a proposal, a new canine program through the state, pairing retired canine dogs with children overcoming trauma. The first partner in the program was Marble. On the day the paperwork was signed, Lily walked through the fields outside the center, her sketchbook tucked under one arm. Marble padded beside her, golden coat glowing in the sunlight. She reached down and took his paw. It wasn't a handshake, but it said everything. Sometimes. The loudest cries for help are spoken in silence. Lily never needed words to reveal the truth, only trust, courage, and the quiet companionship of a dog who had once faced darkness himself, in a world that often rushes past pain. It's a miracle when one's soul, whether child or animal, reaches out and is heard. Perhaps it wasn't just Marble's training that guided him, it was something greater. Maybe, just maybe, God sent him to stand in the gap when Lily couldn't speak. We are reminded that healing doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes, it comes in a paw gently rested on a child's knee, or in a whispered "good boy" after months of silence. That is how grace works, quiet, steady, and unwavering in our everyday lives. We may walk past someone carrying invisible wounds. Let Lily's story inspire you to look closer, listen deeper, and believe that no one is beyond hope. Because even in the darkest hour, God can send a protector. Sometimes. That guardian comes on 4 legs and wrapped in golden fur. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances. Leave a comment to show your support for children like Lily and heroes like Marble. Type Amen in the comments if you believe that God still performs miracles through love, loyalty, and silent strength. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of hope, healing, and redemption. May God bless you and protect those you love.